CHAPTER 22. In Camp. A little after noon the iceberg was within a mile of the land. After dinner the crew climbed up to the topmost block, on which Dirk Peters was stationed. On our approach the half-breed descended the opposite slope, and when I reached the top he was no longer to be seen. The land on the north evidently formed a continent or island of considerable extent. On the west there was a sharply projecting cape, surmounted by a sloping height which resembled an enormous seal's head on the side view. Then beyond that was a wide stretch of sea. On the east the land was prolonged out of sight. Each one of us took in the position. It depended on the current whether it would carry the iceberg into an eddy which might drive it on the coast, or continue to drift it towards the north. Which was the more admissible hypothesis? Captain Len Guy, West, Hurliguerly, and I talked over the matter, while the crew discussed it amongst themselves. Finally it was agreed that the current tended rather to carry the iceberg towards the northern point of land. "After all," said Captain Len Guy, "if it is habitable during the months of the summer season, it does not look like being inhabited, since we cannot descry a human being on the shore." "Let us bear in mind, captain," said I, "that the iceberg is not calculated to attract attention as the Halbrane would have done." "Evidently, Mr. Jeorling, and the natives, if there were any, would have been collected on the beach to see the Halbrane already." "We must not conclude, captain, because we do not see any natives." "Certainly not, Mr. Jeorling, but you will agree with me that the aspect of this land is very unlike that of Tsalal Island when the Jane reached it. There is nothing here but desolation and barrenness." "I acknowledge that. Barrenness and desolation, that is all. Nevertheless, I want to ask you whether it is your intention to go ashore, captain?" "With the boat?" "With the boat, should the current carry our iceberg away from the land." "We have not an hour to lose, Mr. Jeorling, and the delay of a few hours might condemn us to a cruel winter stay, if we arrive too late at the iceberg barrier." "And considering the distance, we are not too soon," observed West. "I grant it," I replied, still persisting, "but to leave this land behind us without ever having set foot on it, without having made sure that it does not preserve the traces of an encampment, if your brother, his companions—" Captain Len Guy shook his head. How could the castaways have supported life in this desolate region for several months? Besides, the British flag was hoisted on the summit of the iceberg, and William Guy would have recognized it and come down to the shore had he been living. No one. At this moment, West, who had been observing certain points of approach, said, "Let us wait a little before we come to a decision. In less than an hour we shall be able to decide. Our speed is slackening, it seems to me, and it is possible that an eddy may bring us obliquely to the coast." "That is my opinion too," said the boatswain, "and if our floating machine is not stationary, it is nearly so. It seems to be turning round." West and Hurliguerly were not mistaken. For some reason or other, the iceberg was getting out of the course which it had followed continuously. A gyratory movement had succeeded to that of drifting, owing to the action of an eddy which set towards the coast. Besides, several ice mountains in front of us had just run aground on the edge of the shore. It was, then, useless to discuss whether we should take to the boat or not. According as we approached, the desolation of the land became more and more apparent, and the prospect of enduring 6 months wintering there would have appalled the stoutest hearts. At 5 in the afternoon the iceberg plunged into a deep rift in the coast ending in a long point on the right, and there stuck fast. "On shore! On shore!" burst from every man, like a single exclamation, and the men were already hurrying down the slope of the iceberg when West commanded, "Wait for orders." Some hesitation was shown, especially on the part of Hearne and several of his comrades. Then the instinct of discipline prevailed, and finally the whole crew ranged themselves around Captain Len Guy. It was not necessary to lower the boat, the iceberg being in contact with the point. The captain, the boatswain, and myself, preceding the others, were the first to quit the camp. Ours were the first human feet to tread this virgin and volcanic soil. We walked 20 minutes on rough land, strewn with rocks of igneous origin, solidified lava, dusty slag, and grey ashes, but without enough clay to grow even the hardiest plants. With some risk and difficulty, Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, and I succeeded in climbing the hill. This exploit occupied a whole hour. Although evening had come now, it brought no darkness in its train. From the top of the hill we could see over an extent of from 30 to 40 miles, and this was what we saw. Behind us lay the open sea, laden with floating masses. A great number of these had recently heaped themselves up against the beach and rendered it almost inaccessible. On the west was a strip of hilly land, which extended beyond our sight, and was washed on the east side by a boundless sea. It was evident that we had been carried by the drift through a strait. Ah, if only we had our Halbrane! But our sole possession was a frail craft, barely capable of containing a dozen men, and we were 23. There was nothing for it but to go down to the shore again, to carry the tents to the beach, and take measures in view of a winter sojourn under the terrible conditions imposed upon us by circumstances. On our return to the coast, the boatswain discovered several caverns in the gigantic cliffs, sufficiently spacious to house us all and afford storage for the cargo of the Halbrane. Whatever might be our ultimate decision, we could not do better than place our material and install ourselves in this opportune shelter. After we had reascended the slopes of the iceberg and reached our camp, Captain Len Guy had the men mustered. The only missing man was Dirk Peters, who had decidedly isolated himself from the crew. There was nothing to fear from him, however. He would be the faithful against the mutinous, and under all circumstances we might count upon him. When the circle had been formed, Captain Len Guy spoke, without allowing any sign of discouragement to appear, and explained the position with the utmost frankness and lucidity, stating in the first place that it was absolutely necessary to lower the cargo to the coast and stow it away in one of the caverns. Concerning the vital question of food, he stated that the supply of flour, preserved meat, and dried vegetables would suffice for the winter, however prolonged, and on that of fuel he was satisfied that we should not want for coal, provided it was not wasted, and it would be possible to economize it, as the hibernating waifs might brave the cold of the polar zone under a covering of snow and a roof of ice. Was the captain's tone of security feigned? I did not think so, especially as West approved of what he said. A third question raised by Hearne remained, and was well calculated to arouse jealousy and anger amongst the crew. It was the question of the use to be made of the only craft remaining to us. Ought the boat to be kept for the needs of our hibernation, or used to enable us to return to the iceberg barrier? Captain Len Guy would not pronounce upon this. He desired to postpone the decision for 24 or 48 hours. The boat, carrying the provisions necessary for such a voyage, could not accommodate more than 11, or at the outside 12 men. If the departure of the boat were agreed to, then its passengers must be selected by lot. The captain proceeded to state that neither West, the boatswain, I, nor he would claim any privilege, but would submit to the fortune of the lot with all the others. Both Martin Holt and Hardy were perfectly capable of taking the boat to the fishing grounds, where the whalers would still be found. Then those to whom the lot should fall were not to forget their comrades left to winter on the 86th parallel, and were to send a ship to take them off at the return of summer. All this was said in a tone as calm as it was firm. I must do Captain Len Guy the justice to say that he rose to the occasion. When he had concluded, without any interruption even from Hearne, no one made a remark. There was indeed none to be made, since, in the given case, lots were to be drawn under conditions of perfect equality. The hour of rest having arrived, each man entered the camp, partook of the supper prepared by Endicott, and went to sleep for the last time under the tents. Dirk Peters had not reappeared, and I sought for him in vain. On the following day, the 7th of February, everybody set to work early with a will. The boat was let down with all due precaution to the base of the iceberg, and drawn up by the men on a little sandy beach out of reach of the water. It was in perfectly good condition and thoroughly serviceable. The boatswain then set to work on the former contents of the Halbrane: furniture, bedding, sails, clothing, instruments, and utensils. Stowed away in a cabin, these things would no longer be exposed to the knocking about and damage of the iceberg. The cases containing preserved food and the casks of spirits were rapidly carried ashore. I worked with the captain and West at this onerous task, and Dirk Peters also turned up and lent the valuable assistance of his great strength, but he did not utter a word to any one. Our occupation continued on the 8th, 9th, and 10th February, and our task was finished in the afternoon of the 10th. The cargo was safely stowed in the interior of a large grotto, with access to it by a narrow opening. We were to inhabit the adjoining grotto, and Endicott set up his kitchen in the latter, on the advice of the boatswain. Thus we should profit by the heat of the stove, which was to cook our food and warm the cavern during the long days, or rather the long nights, of the austral winter. During the process of housing and storing, I observed nothing to arouse suspicion in the bearing of Hearne and the Falklands men. Nevertheless, the half-breed was kept on guard at the boat, which might easily have been seized upon the beach. Hurliguerly, who observed his comrades closely, appeared less anxious. On that same evening, Captain Len Guy, having reassembled his people, stated that the question should be discussed on the morrow, adding that, if it were decided in the affirmative, lots should be drawn immediately. No reply was made. It was late, and half dark outside, for at this date the sun was on the edge of the horizon, and would very soon disappear below it. I had been asleep for some hours when I was awakened by a great shouting at a short distance. I sprang up instantly and darted out of the cavern, simultaneously with the captain and West, who had been suddenly aroused from sleep. "The boat! The boat!" cried West. The boat was no longer in its place, that place so jealously guarded by Dirk Peters. After they had pushed the boat into the sea, 3 men had got into it with bales and casks, while 10 others strove to control the half-breed. Hearne was there, and Martin Holt also. The latter, it seemed to me, was not interfering. Those wretches, then, intended to depart before the lots were drawn. They meant to forsake us. They had succeeded in surprising Dirk Peters, and they would have killed him had he not fought hard for his life. In the face of this mutiny, knowing our inferiority of numbers, and not knowing whether he might count on all the old crew, Captain Len Guy re-entered the cavern with West in order to procure arms. Hearne and his accomplices were armed. I was about to follow them, when the following words arrested my steps. The half-breed, overpowered by numbers, had been knocked down, and at this moment Martin Holt, in gratitude to the man who saved his life, was rushing to his aid, but Hearne called out to him: "Leave the fellow alone, and come with us." Martin Holt hesitated. "Yes, leave him alone, I say. Leave Dirk Peters, the assassin of your brother, alone." "The assassin of my brother?" "Your brother, killed on board the Grampus." "Killed? By Dirk Peters?" "Yes, killed and eaten, eaten," replied Hearne, who pronounced the hateful words with a kind of howl. And then, at a sign from Hearne, 2 of his comrades seized Martin Holt and dragged him into the boat. Hearne was instantly followed by all those whom he had induced to join in his criminal deed. At that moment Dirk Peters rose from the ground and sprang upon one of the Falkland men as he was in the act of stepping on the platform of the boat, lifted him up bodily, hurled him round his head, and dashed his brains out against a rock. In an instant the half-breed fell, shot in the shoulder by a bullet from Hearne's pistol, and the boat was pushed off. Then Captain Len Guy and West came out of the cavern. The whole scene had passed in less than a minute, and ran down to the point which they reached together with the boatswain, Hardy, Francis, and Stern. The boat, which was drawn by the current, was already some distance off, and the tide was falling rapidly. West shouldered his gun and fired. A sailor dropped into the bottom of the boat. A second shot, fired by Len Guy, grazed Hearne's breast, and the ball was lost amongst the ice blocks at the moment when the boat disappeared behind the iceberg. The only thing for us to do was to cross to the other side of the point. The current would carry the wretches thither, no doubt, before it bore them northward. If they passed within range, and if a second shot should hit Hearne, either killing or wounding him, his companions might perhaps decide on coming back to us. A quarter of an hour elapsed. When the boat appeared at the other side of the point, it was so far off that our bullets could not reach it. Hearne had already had the sail set, and the boat, impelled by wind and current jointly, was soon no more than a white speck on the face of the waters, and speedily disappeared. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. Found at last. The question of our wintering on the land whereon we had been thrown was settled for us. But, after all, the situation was not changed for those among the 9, now only remaining of the 23, who should not have drawn the lot of departure. Who could speculate upon the chances of the whole 9? Might not all of them have drawn the lot of stay? And, when every chance was fully weighed, was that of those who had left us the best? To this question there could be no answer. When the boat had disappeared, Captain Len Guy and his companions retraced their steps towards the cavern in which we must live for all the time during which we could not go out, in the dread darkness of the Antarctic winter. My first thought was of Dirk Peters, who, being wounded, could not follow us when we hurried to the other side of the point. On reaching the cavern, I failed to find the half-breed. Was he severely wounded? Should we have to mourn the death of this man who was as faithful to us as to his poor Pym? "Let us search for him, Mr. Jeorling," cried the boatswain. "We will go together," said the captain. "Dirk Peters would never have forsaken us, and we will not forsake him." "Would he come back," said I, "now that what he thought was known to him and me only has come out?" I informed my companions of the reason why the name of Ned Holt had been changed to that of Parker in Arthur Pym's narrative, and of the circumstances under which the half-breed had apprised me of the fact. At the same time, I urged every consideration that might exculpate him, dwelling in particular upon the point that if the lot had fallen to Dirk Peters, he would have been the victim of the others' hunger. "Dirk Peters confided this secret to you only?" inquired Captain Len Guy. "To me only, captain." "And you have kept it?" "Absolutely." "Then I cannot understand how it came to the knowledge of Hearne." "At first," I replied, "I thought Hearne might have talked in his sleep, and that it was by chance Martin Holt learned the secret. After reflection, however, I recalled to mind that when the half-breed related the scene on the Grampus to me, he was in my cabin, and the side sash was raised. I have reason to think that the man at the wheel overheard our conversation. Now that man was Hearne, who, in order to hear it more clearly, let go the wheel so that the Halbrane lurched." "I remember," said West. "I questioned the fellow sharply, and sent him down into the hold." "Well then, captain," I resumed, "it was from that day that Hearne made up to Martin Holt. Hurliguerly called my attention to the fact." "Of course he did," said the boatswain, "for Hearne, not being capable of managing the boat which he intended to seize, required a master hand like Holt." "And so," I said, "he kept on urging Holt to question the half-breed concerning his brother's fate, and you know how Holt came at last to learn the fearful truth. Martin Holt seemed to be stupefied by the revelation. The others dragged him away, and now he is with them. We were all agreed that things had happened as I supposed, and now the question was, did Dirk Peters, in his present state of mind, mean to absent himself? Would he consent to resume his place among us? We all left the cavern, and after an hour's search we came in sight of Dirk Peters, whose first impulse was to escape from us. At length, however, Hurliguerly and Francis came up with him. He stood still and made no resistance. I advanced and spoke to him. The others did the same. Captain Len Guy offered him his hand, which he took after a moment's hesitation. Then, without uttering a single word, he returned towards the beach. From that day no allusion was ever made to the tragic story of the Grampus. Dirk Peters' wound proved to be slight. He merely wrapped a piece of sailcloth round the injured arm, and went off to his work with entire unconcern. We made all the preparations in our power for a prolonged hibernation. Winter was threatening us. For some days past the sun hardly showed at all through the mists. The temperature fell to 36° and would rise no more, while the solar rays, casting shadows of endless length upon the soil, gave hardly any heat. The captain made us put on warm woolen clothes without waiting for the cold to become more severe. Icebergs, packs, streams, and drifts came in greater numbers from the south. Some of these struck and stayed upon the coast, which was already heaped up with ice, but the greater number disappeared in the direction of the northeast. "All these pieces," said the boatswain, "will go to the closing up of the iceberg wall. If Hearne and his lot of scoundrels are not ahead of them, I imagine they will find the door shut, and as they have no key to open it with. I suppose you think, boatswain, that our case is less desperate than theirs?" "I do think so, Mr. Jeorling, and I have always thought so. If everything had been done as it was settled, and the lot had fallen to me to go with the boat, I would have given up my turn to one of the others. After all, there is something in feeling dry ground under our feet. I don't wish the death of anybody, but if Hearne and his friends do not succeed in clearing the iceberg barrier, if they are doomed to pass the winter on the ice, reduced for food to a supply that will only last a few weeks, you know the fate that awaits them." "Yes, a fate worse than ours." "And besides," said the boatswain, "even supposing they do reach the Antarctic Circle, if the whalers have already left the fishing grounds, it is not a laden and overladen craft that will keep the sea until the Australian coasts are in sight." This was my opinion, and also that of the captain at West. During the following 4 days we completed the storage of the whole of our belongings, and made some excursions into the interior of the country, finding all barren, and not a trace that any landing had ever been made there. One day Captain Len Guy proposed that we should give a geographical name to the region whither the iceberg had carried us. It was named Halbrane Land, in memory of our schooner, and we called the strait that separated the two parts of the polar continent the Jane Sound. Then we took to shooting the penguins which swarmed upon the rocks, and to capturing some of the amphibious animals which frequented the beach. We began to feel the want of fresh meat, and Endicott's cooking rendered seal and walrus flesh quite palatable. Besides, the fat of these creatures would serve at need to warm the cavern and feed the cooking stove. Our most formidable enemy would be the cold, and we must fight it by every means within our power. It remained to be seen whether the amphibia would not forsake Halbrane Land at the approach of winter, and seek a less rigorous climate in lower latitudes. Fortunately, there were hundreds of other animals to secure our little company from hunger, and even from thirst, at need. The beach was the home of numbers of galapagos, a kind of turtle, so called from an archipelago in the equinoctial sea. There also they abound, and mentioned by Arthur Pym as supplying food to the islanders. It will be remembered that Pym and Peters found 3 of these galapagos in the native boat which carried them away from Tsalal Island. The movement of these huge creatures is slow, heavy, and waddling. They have thin necks 2 feet long, triangular snake-like heads, and can go without food for very long periods. Arthur Pym had compared the Antarctic turtles to dromedaries, because, like those ruminants, they have a pouch just where the neck begins, which contains from 2 to 3 gallons of cold fresh water. He relates, before the scene of the lot drawing, that but for one of these turtles the shipwrecked crew of the Grampus must have died of hunger and thirst. If Pym is to be believed, some of the great turtles weigh from 12 to 1,500 pounds. Those of Halbrane Land did not go beyond 700 or 800 pounds, but their flesh was none the less savoury. On the 19th of February an incident occurred, an incident which those who acknowledge the intervention of Providence in human affairs will recognize as providential. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. The weather was calm, the sky was tolerably clear, the thermometer stood at 32° Fahrenheit. We were assembled in the cavern, with the exception of the boatswain, waiting for our breakfast, which Endicott was preparing, and were about to take our places at table, when we heard a call from outside. The voice was Hurliguerly's, and we hurried out. On seeing us, he cried, "Come, come quickly!" He was standing on a rock at the foot of the hillock above the beach in which Halbrane Land ended beyond the point, and his right hand was stretched out towards the sea. "What is it?" asked Captain Len Guy. "A boat." "Is the Halbrane's boat coming back?" "No, captain, it is not." Then we perceived a boat, not to be mistaken for that of our schooner in form or dimensions, drifting without oars or paddle, seemingly abandoned to the current. We had but one idea in common, to seize at any cost upon this derelict craft, which would, perhaps, prove our salvation. But how were we to reach it? How were we to get it to the point of Halbrane Land? While we were looking distractedly at the boat and at each other, there came a sudden splash at the end of the hillock, as though a body had fallen into the sea. It was Dirk Peters, who, having flung off his clothes, had sprung from the top of a rock, and was swimming rapidly towards the boat before we made him out. We cheered him heartily. I never beheld anything like that swimming. He bounded through the waves like a porpoise, and indeed he possessed the strength and swiftness of one. What might not be expected of such a man? In a few minutes the half-breed had swum several cables' lengths towards the boat in an oblique direction. We could only see his head like a black speck on the surface of the rolling waves. A period of suspense, of intense watching of the brave swimmer, succeeded. Surely, surely he would reach the boat. But must he not be carried away with it? Was it to be believed that even his great strength would enable him, swimming, to tow it to the beach? "After all, why should there not be oars in the boat?" said the boatswain. "He has it! He has it! Hurrah, Dirk, hurrah!" shouted Hurliguerly, and Endicott echoed his exultant cheer. The half-breed had, in fact, reached the boat, and raised himself alongside, half out of the water. His big strong hand grasped the side, and at the risk of causing the boat to capsize, he hoisted himself up to the side, stepped over it, and sat down to draw his breath. Almost instantly a shout reached our ears. It was uttered by Dirk Peters. What had he found? Paddles? It must be so, for we saw him seat himself in the front of the boat, and paddle with all his strength in striving to get out of the current. "Come along," said the captain, and, turning the base of the hillock, we all ran along the edge of the beach between the blackish stones that bestrew it. After some time West stopped us. The boat had reached the shelter of a small projection at that place, and it was evident that it would be run ashore there. When it was within 5 or 6 cables' length, the eddy was helping it on. Dirk Peters let go the paddles, stooped forwards the after part of the boat, and then raised himself, holding up an inert body. An agonized cry from Captain Len Guy rent the air. "My brother! My brother!" "He is living! He is living!" shouted Dirk Peters. A moment later the boat had touched the beach, and Captain Len Guy held his brother in his arms. 3 of William Guy's companions lay apparently lifeless at the bottom of the boat, and these 4 men were all that remained of the crew of the Jane. Chapter 24. Chapter 24. 11 years in a few pages. The heading of the following chapter indicates that the adventures of William Guy and his companions after destruction of the English schooner, and the details of their history subsequent to the departure of Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, are about to be narrated with all possible brevity. We carried our treasure trove to the cavern, and had happiness of restoring all 4 men to life. In reality it was hunger, nothing but hunger, which had reduced the poor fellows to the semblance of death. On the 8th of February, 1828, the crew of the Jane, having no reason to doubt the good faith of the population of Tsalal Island, or that of their chief, Too Wit, disembarked in order to visit the village of Klock Klock, having previously put the schooner into a state of defence, leaving 6 men on board. The crew, counting William Guy, the captain, Arthur Pym, and Dirk Peters, formed a body of 32 men, armed with guns, pistols, and knives. The dog Tiger accompanied them. On reaching the narrow gorge leading to the village, preceded and followed by the numerous warriors of Too Wit, the little company divided, Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen the sailor entering a cleft in the hillside, with the intention of crossing it to the other side. From that moment their companions were never to see them more. After a short interval a shock was felt. The opposite hill fell down in a vast heap, burying William Guy and his 28 companions. 22 of these unfortunate men were crushed to death on the instant, and their bodies would never be found under that mass of earth. 7, miraculously sheltered in the depth of a great cleft of the hill, had survived the catastrophe. These were William Guy, Patterson, Roberts, Coyin, Trinkle, also Forbes and Sexton, since dead. As for Tiger, they knew not whether he had perished in the landslip or whether he had escaped. There existed in the right side of the hill, as well as in the left, on either side of the fissure, certain winding passages, and it was by crawling along these in the darkness that William Guy, Patterson, and the others reached a cavity which let in light and air in abundance. From this shelter they beheld the attack on the Jane by 60 pirogues, the defence made by the 6 men on board, the invasion of the ship by the savages, and finally the explosion which caused the death of a vast number of natives, as well as the complete destruction of the ship. Too Wit and the Tsalal Islanders were at first terrified by the effects of this explosion, but probably still more disappointed. Their instincts of pillage could not be gratified, because some valueless wreckage was all that remained of the ship and her cargo, and they had no reason to suppose that any of the crew had survived the cleverly contrived collapse of the hill. Hence it came about that Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters on the one side, and William Guy and his companions on the other, were enabled to remain undisturbed in the labyrinth of Klock Klock, where they fed on the flesh of bitterns. These they could catch with their hands, and the fruit of the nut trees which grow on the hillsides. They procured fire by rubbing pieces of soft against pieces of hard wood. There was a quantity of both within their reach. After a whole week of this confinement, Arthur Pym and the half-breed had succeeded, as we know, in leaving their hiding-place, securing a boat, and abandoning Tsalal Island, but William Guy and his companions had not yet found an opportunity to escape. After they had been shut up in the labyrinth for 21 days, the birds on which they lived began to fail them, and they recognized that their only means of escaping hunger— they had not to fear thirst, for there was a spring of fresh water in the interior of the hill— was to go down again to the coast, lay hands upon a native boat, and get out to sea. Where were the fugitives to go, and what was to become of them without provisions? These were the questions that had to be asked, and which nobody could answer. Nevertheless, they would not have hesitated to attempt the adventure if they could have a few hours of darkness. But at that time of the year the sun did not as yet go down behind the horizon of the 84th parallel. Death would probably have put an end to their misery had not the situation been changed by the following events. On the 22nd of February, in the morning, William Guy and Patterson were talking together in terrible perplexity of mind at the orifice of the cavity that opened upon the country. They no longer knew how to provide for the wants of 7 persons, who were then reduced to eating nuts only, and were suffering in consequence from severe pain in the head and stomach. They could see big turtles crawling on the beach, but how could they venture to go thither, with hundreds of natives coming and going about their several occupations, with their constant cry of "Tekeli-li"? Suddenly this crowd of people became violently agitated. Men, women, and children ran wildly about on every side. Some of the savages even took to their boats as though a great danger were at hand. What was happening? William Guy and his companions were very soon informed. The cause of the tumult was the appearance of an unknown animal, a terrible quadruped, which dashed into the midst of the islanders, snapping at and biting them indiscriminately, as it sprang at their throats with a hoarse growling. And yet the infuriated animal was alone, and might easily have been killed by stones or arrows. Why then did a crowd of savages manifest such abject terror? Why did they take to flight? Why did they appear incapable of defending themselves against this one beast? The animal was white, and the sight of it had produced the phenomenon previously observed, that inexplicable terror of whiteness common to all the natives of Tsalal. To their extreme surprise, William Guy and his companions recognized the strange animal as the dog Tiger. Yes, Tiger had escaped from the crumbling mass of the hill and betaken himself to the interior of the island, whence he had returned to Klock Klock to spread terror among the natives. But Tiger was no mere phantom foe, for he was the most dangerous and deadly of enemies, for the poor animal was mad, and his fangs were fatal. This was the reason why the greater part of Tsalal islanders took to flight, headed by their chief Too Wit and the Wampos, who are the leading personages of Klock Klock. It was under these extraordinary circumstances that they abandoned their island, whither they were destined never to return. Although the boats carried off the bulk of the population, a considerable number still remained on Tsalal, having no means of escape, and their fate accomplished itself quickly. Several natives who were bitten by Tiger developed hydrophobia rapidly, and attacked the others. Fearful scenes ensued, and are briefly to be summed up in one dismal statement. The bones we had seen in or near Klock Klock were those of the poor savages which had lain there bleaching for 11 years. The poor dog had died after he had done his fell work, in a corner on the beach, where Dirk Peters found his skeleton and the collar bearing the name of Arthur Pym. Then, after those natives who could not escape from the island had all perished in the manner described, William Guy, Patterson, Trinkle, Coven, Forbes, and Sexton ventured to come out of the labyrinth, where they were on the verge of death by starvation. What sort of existence was that of the 7 survivors of the expedition during the 11 ensuing years? On the whole, it was more endurable than might have been supposed. The natural products of an extremely fertile soil, and the presence of a certain number of domestic animals, secured them against want of food. They had only to make out the best shelter for themselves they could contrive, and wait for an opportunity of getting away from the island with as much patience as might be granted to them. And from whence could such an opportunity come? Only from one of the chances within the resources of Providence. Captain William Guy, Patterson, and their 5 companions descended on the ravine, which was half filled with the fallen masses of the hill face, amid heaps of scoria and blocks of black granite. Before they left this gorge it occurred to William Guy to explore the fissure on the right into which Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen had turned, but he found it blocked up. It was impossible for him to get into the pass. Thus he remained in ignorance of the existence of the natural or artificial labyrinth which corresponded with the one he had just left, and probably communicated with it under the dry bed of the torrent. The little company, having passed the chaotic barrier that intercepted the northern route, proceeded rapidly towards the northwest. There, on the coast, at about 3 miles from Klock Klock, they established themselves in a grotto very like that in our own occupation on the coast of Halbrane Land. And it was in this place that, during long, hopeless years, the 7 survivors of the Jane lived, as we were about to do ourselves, but under better conditions, for the fertility of the soil of Tsalal furnished them with resources unknown in Halbrane Land. In reality, we were condemned to perish when our provisions should be exhausted, but they could have waited indefinitely, and they did wait. They had never entertained any doubt that Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen had perished, and this was only too true in Allen's case. How indeed could they have ever imagined that Pym and the half-breed had got hold of a boat and made their escape from Tsalal Island? So then, as William Guy told us, Not an incident occurred to break the monotony of that existence of 11 years, not even the reappearance of the islanders, who were kept away from Tsalal by superstitious terror. No danger had threatened them during all that time, but of course, as it became more and more prolonged, they lost the hope of ever being rescued. At first, with the return of the fine season, when the sea was once more open, they had thought it possible that a ship would be sent in search of the Jane, but after 4 or 5 years they relinquished all hope. There is no need for dwelling on this period, which extends from the year 1828 to the year 1839. The winters were hard. The summer did indeed extend its beneficent influence to the islands of the Tsalal group, but the cold season, with its attendant snows, rains, and tempests, spared them none of its severity. During 7 months Captain William Guy had not lost one of those who had come with him safe and sound out of the trap set for them at Klock Klock, and this was due, no doubt, to their robust constitutions, remarkable power of endurance, and great strength of character. Alas! misfortune was making ready to fall on them. The month of May had come. It corresponds in those regions to the month of November in northern lands, and the ice packs which the current carried towards the north were beginning to drift past Tsalal. One day one of the 7 men failed to return to the cavern. They called, they waited, they searched for him. All was in vain. He did not reappear. No doubt he had been drowned. He was never more seen by his fellow exiles. This man was Patterson, the faithful companion of William Guy. Now, what William Guy did not know, but we told him, was that Patterson, under what circumstances none would ever learn, had been carried away on the surface of an ice block, where he died of hunger. And on that ice block, which had travelled so far as Prince Edward Island, the boatswain had discovered the corpse of the unfortunate man, almost decomposed by the action of the warmer waters. When Captain Len Guy told his brother of the finding of the body of Patterson, and how it was owing to the notes in his pocket-book that the Halbrane had been enabled to proceed towards the Antarctic seas, William Guy hid his face in his hands and wept. Other misfortunes followed upon this one. 5 months after the disappearance of Patterson, in the middle of October, Tsalal Island was laid waste from coast to coast by an earthquake, which destroyed the south-western group almost entirely. William Guy and his companions must soon have perished on the barren land, which no longer could give them food, had not the means of leaving its coast, now merely an expanse of tumbled rocks, been afforded them in an almost miraculous manner. 2 days after the earthquake, the current carried ashore within a few hundred yards of their cavern a boat which had drifted from the island group on the south-west. Without delay of even 1 day, the boat was laden with as much of the remaining provisions as it could contain, and the 6 men embarked in it, bidding adieu for ever to the now uninhabitable island. Unfortunately, a very strong breeze was blowing. It was impossible to resist it, and the boat was driven southward by that very same current which had caused our iceberg to drift to the coast of Halbrane Land. For 2 months and a half these poor fellows were borne across the open sea, with no control over their course. It was not until the 2nd January in the present year, 1840, that they sighted land, east of the Jane Sound. Now we already knew this land was not more than 50 miles from Halbrane Land. Yes, so small relatively was the distance that separated us from those whom we had sought for in the Antarctic regions far and wide, and concerning whom we had lost hope. Their boat had gone ashore far to the southeast of us, but on how different a coast from that of Tsalal Island, or rather, on one how like that of Halbrane Land. Nothing was to be seen but sand and stones, neither trees, shrubs, nor plants of any kind. Their provisions were almost exhausted. William Guy and his companions were soon reduced to extreme want, and 2 of the little company, Forbes and Sexton, died. The remaining 4 resolved not to remain a single day longer in the place where they were doomed to die of hunger. They embarked in the boat with a small supply of food still remaining, and once more abandoned themselves to the current, without having been able to verify their position for want of instruments. Thus they had been borne upon the unknown deep for 25 days, their resources were completely exhausted, and they had not eaten for 48 hours when the boat, with its occupants, lying inanimate at the bottom of it, was sighted from Halbrane Land. The rest is already known to the reader of this strange, eventful history. And now the two brothers were at length reunited in that remote corner of the big world which we had dubbed Halbrane Land. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. We were the first. 2 days later, not one of the survivors from the two schooners, the Jane and the Halbrane, remained upon any coast of the Antarctic region. On the 21st of February, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the boat with us all, we numbered 13 in it, left the little creek and doubled the point of Halbrane Land. On the previous day we had fully and finally debated the question of our departure, with the understanding that if it were settled in the affirmative we should start without delay. The captain of the Jane was for an immediate departure, and Captain Len Guy was not opposed to it. I willingly sided with them, and West was of similar opinion. The boatswain was inclined to oppose us. He considered it imprudent to give up a certainty for the uncertain, and he was backed by Endicott, who would in any case say ditto to his Mr. Burke. However, when the time came, Hurliguerly conformed to the view of the majority with a good grace, and declared himself quite ready to set out, since we were all that way of thinking. Our boat was one of those in use in the Tsalal archipelago for plying between the islands. We knew from the narrative of Arthur Pym that these boats were of two kinds, one resembling rafts or flat boats, the other strongly built pirogues. Our boat was of the former kind, 4 feet long, 6 feet in width, and worked by several paddles. We called our little craft Parukera, after a fish which abounds in these waters. A rough image of that denizen of the southern deep was cut upon the gunwale. Needless to say that the greater part of the cargo of the Halbrane was left in our cavern, fully protected from weather, at the disposal of any shipwrecked people who might chance to be thrown on the coast of Halbrane Land. The boatswain had planted a spar on the top of this slope to attract attention, but our two schooners notwithstanding, what vessel would ever venture into such latitudes? Nota bene. We were just 13, the fatal number. Perfectly good relations subsisted amongst us. We had no longer to dread the rebellion of a Hearne. How often we had speculated upon the fate of those whom he had beguiled! At 7 o'clock the extreme point of Halbrane Land lay 5 miles behind us, and in the evening we gradually lost sight of the heights that variated that part of the coast. I desired to lay special stress on the fact that not a single scrap of iron entered into the construction of this boat, not so much as a nail or a bolt, for that metal was entirely unknown to the Tsalal islanders. The planks were bound together by a sort of liana, or creeping plant, and caulked with moss steeped in pitch, which was turned by contact with the sea water to a substance as hard as metal. I have nothing special to record during the week that succeeded our departure. The breeze blew steadily from the south, and we did not meet with any unfavourable current between the banks of the Jane Sound. During those first 8 days, the Paracuta, by paddling when the wind fell, had kept up the speed that was indispensable for our reaching the Pacific Ocean within a short time. The desolate aspect of the land remained the same, while the strait was already visited by floating drifts, packs of 100 to 200 feet in length, some oblong, others circular, and also by icebergs, which our boat passed easily. We were made anxious, however, by the fact that these masses were proceeding towards the ice barrier, for would they not close the passages which ought to be still open at this time? I shall mention here that in proportion as Dirk Peters was carried further and further from the places wherein no trace of his poor Pym had been found, he was more silent than ever, and no longer even answered me when I addressed him. It must not be forgotten that since our iceberg had passed beyond the South Pole, we were in the zone of eastern longitudes, counted from the zero of Greenwich to the 180th degree. All hope must therefore be abandoned of our either touching at the Falklands, or finding whaling ships in the waters of the Sandwich Islands, the South Orkneys, or South Georgia. Our voyage proceeded under unaltered conditions for 10 days. Our little craft was perfectly seaworthy. The two captains and West fully appreciated its soundness, although, as I have said previously, not a scrap of iron had a place in its construction. It had not once been necessary to repair its seams, so staunch were they. To be sure, the sea was smooth. Its long, rolling waves were hardly ruffled on their surface. On the 10th of March, with the same longitude, the observation gave 7 degrees 13 minutes for latitude. The speed of the Paracuta had then been 30 miles in each 24 hours. If this rate of progress could be maintained for 3 weeks, there was every chance of our finding the passes open, and being able to get round the ice barrier; also that the whaling ships would not yet have left the fishing grounds. The sun was on the verge of the horizon, and the time was approaching when the Antarctic region should be shrouded in polar night. Fortunately, in reascending towards the north, we were getting into waters from whence light was not yet banished. Then did we witness a phenomenon as extraordinary as any of those described by Arthur Pym. For 3 or 4 hours, sparks, accompanied by a sharp noise, shot out of our fingers' ends, our hair, and our beards. There was an electric snowstorm, with great flakes falling loosely, and the contact produced this strange luminosity. The sea rose so suddenly and tumbled about so wildly that the Paracuta was several times in danger of being swallowed up by the waves, but we got through the mystic seeming tempest all safe and sound. Nevertheless, space was thenceforth but imperfectly lighted. Frequent mists came up and bounded our outlook to a few cables' length. Extreme watchfulness and caution were necessary to avoid collision with the floating masses of ice, which were travelling more slowly than the Paracuta. It is also to be noted, on the southern side, the sky was frequently lighted up by the broad and brilliant rays of the polar aurora. The temperature fell very precipitously, and no longer rose above 23 degrees. 48 hours later, Captain Len Guy and his brother succeeded with great difficulty in taking an approximate observation, with the following results of their calculations: latitude 75 degrees 17 minutes south, longitude 118 degrees 13 minutes east. At this date, therefore, 12th March, the Paracuta was distant from the waters of the Antarctic Circle only 400 miles. During the night a thick fog came on, with a subsidence of the breeze. This was to be regretted, for it increased the risk of collision with the floating ice. Of course, fog could not be a surprise to us, being where we were, but what did surprise us was the gradually increasing speed of our boat, although the falling of the wind ought to have lessened it. This increase of speed could not be due to the current, for we were going more quickly than it. This state of things lasted until morning, without our being able to account for what was happening, when at about 10 o'clock the mist began to disappear in the low zones. The coast on the west reappeared, a rocky coast, without a mountainous background. The Paracuta was following its line. And then, no more than a quarter of a mile away, we beheld a huge mound, reared above the plain to a height of 300 feet, with a circumference of from 200 to 300 feet. In its strange form, this great mound resembled an enormous Sphinx, the body upright, the paws stretched out, crouching in the attitude of the winged monster which Grecian mythology has placed upon the way to Thebes. Was this a living animal, a gigantic monster, a mastodon 1,000 times the size of those enormous elephants of the polar seas whose remains are still found in the ice? In our frame of mind we might have believed that it was such a creature, and believed also that the mastodon was about to hurl itself on our little craft and crush it to atoms. After a few moments of unreasoning and unreasonable fright, we recognized that the strange object was only a great mound, singularly shaped, and that the mists had just rolled off its head, leaving it to stand out and confront us. Ah, that Sphinx! I remembered at the sight of it that on the night when the iceberg was overturned and the Halbrane was carried away, I had dreamed of a fabulous animal of this kind, seated at the pole of the world, and from whom Edgar Poe could only wrest its secrets. But our attention was to be attracted, our surprise, even our alarm, was evoked soon by phenomena still more strange than the mysterious earth form upon which the mist curtain had been raised so suddenly. I have said that the speed of the Paracuta was gradually increasing. Now it was excessive, that of the current remaining inferior to it. Now, of a sudden, the grapnel that had belonged to the Halbrane, and was in the bow of the boat, flew out of its socket as though drawn by an irresistible power, and the rope that held it was strained to the breaking point. It seemed to tow us as it grazed the surface of the water towards the shore. "What's the matter?" cried William Guy. "Cut away, boatswain, cut away!" shouted West, "or we shall be dragged against the rocks." Hurliguerly hurried to the bow of the Paracuta to cut away the rope. Of a sudden the knife he held was snatched out of his hand, the rope broke, and the grapnel, like a projectile, shot off in the direction of the Sphinx. At the same moment all the articles on board the boat that were made of iron or steel, cooking utensils, arms, Endicott's stove, our knives, which were torn from out of pockets, took flight after a similar fashion in the same direction, while the boat, quickening its course, brought up against the beach. What was happening? In order to explain these inexplicable things, were we not obliged to acknowledge that we had come into the region of those wonders which I had attributed to the hallucinations of Arthur Pym? No, these were physical facts which we had just witnessed, and not imaginary phenomena. We had, however, no time for reflection, and immediately upon our landing our attention was turned in another direction by the sight of a boat lying wrecked upon the sand. "The Halbrane's boat!" cried Hurliguerly. It was indeed the boat which Hearne had stolen, and it was simply smashed to pieces. In a word, only the formless wreckage of a craft which had been flung against the rocks by the sea remained. We observed immediately that all the ironwork of the boat had disappeared, down to the hinges of the rudder. Not one trace of the metal existed. What could be the meaning of this? A loud call from West brought us to a little strip of beach on the right of our stranded boat. 3 corpses lay upon the stony soil, that of Hearne, that of Martin Holt, and that of one of the Falklands men. Of the 13 who had gone with the sealing master, there remained only these 3, who had evidently been dead some days. What had become of the 10 missing men? Had their bodies been carried out to sea? We searched all along the coast, into the creeks, and between the outlying rocks, but in vain. Nothing was to be found. No traces of a camp, not even the vestiges of a landing. "Their boat," said William Guy, "must have been struck by a drifting iceberg. The rest of Hearne's companions have been drowned, and only these 3 bodies have come ashore lifeless." "But," asked the boatswain, "how is the state the boat is in to be explained?" "And especially," added West, "the disappearance of all the iron." "Indeed," said I, "it looks as though every bit had been violently torn off." Leaving the Paracuta in the charge of 2 men, we again took our way to the interior, in order to extend our search over a wider expanse. As we were approaching the huge mound, the mist cleared away, and the form stood out with greater distinctness. It was, as I have said, almost that of a sphinx, a dusky-hued sphinx, as though the matter which composed it had been oxidized by the inclemency of the polar climate. And then a possibility flashed into my mind, an hypothesis which explained these astonishing phenomena. "Ah!" I exclaimed, "a lodestone! That is it! A magnet with prodigious power of attraction!" I was understood, and in an instant The final catastrophe to which Hearne and his companions were victims was explained with terrible clearness. The Antarctic Sphinx was simply a colossal magnet. Under the influence of that magnet, the iron bands of the Halbrane's boat had been torn out and projected as though by the action of a catapult. This was the occult force that had irresistibly attracted everything made of iron on the Paracuta, and the boat itself would have shared the fate of the Halbrane's boat had a single bit of metal been employed in its construction. Was it, then, the proximity of the magnetic pole that produced such effects? At first we entertained this idea, but on reflection we rejected it. At the place where the magnetic meridians cross, the only phenomenon produced is the vertical position of the magnetic needle in two similar points of the terrestrial globe. This phenomenon, already proved by observations made on the spot, must be identical in the Antarctic regions. Thus, then, there did exist a magnet of prodigious intensity in the zone of attraction which we had entered. Under our eyes, one of those surprising effects which had hitherto been classed among fables was actually produced. The following appeared to me to be the true explanation. The trade winds bring a constant succession of clouds or mists in which immense quantities of electricity, not completely exhausted by storms, are stored. Hence there exists a formidable accumulation of electric fluid at the poles, and it flows towards the land in a permanent stream. From this cause come the northern and southern auroras, whose luminous splendours shine above the horizon, especially during the long polar night, and are visible even in the temperate zones when they attain their maximum of culmination. These continuous currents at the poles, which bewilder our compasses, might possess an extraordinary influence, and it would suffice that a block of iron should be subjected to their action for it could be changed into a magnet of power proportioned to the intensity of the current, to the number of turns of the electric helix, and to the square root of the diameter of the block of magnetized iron. Thus, then, the bulk of the Sphinx, which upreared its mystic form upon this outer edge of the southern lands, might be calculated by thousands of cubic yards. Now, in order that the current should circulate around it, and make a magnet of it by induction, what was required? Nothing but a metallic lode, whose innumerable windings through the bowels of the soil should be connected subterraneously at the base of the block. It seemed to me that the place of this block ought to be in the magnetic axis, as a sort of gigantic calamite, from whence the imponderable fluid, whose currents made an inexhaustible accumulator set up at the confines of the world, should issue. Our compass could not have enabled us to determine whether the marvel before our eyes really was at the magnetic pole of the southern regions. All I can say is, that the needle staggered about, helpless and useless, and in fact the exact location of the Antarctic Sphinx mattered little in respect of the constitution of that artificial lodestone, and the manner in which the clouds and metallic load supplied its attractive power. In this very plausible fashion I was led to explain the phenomenon by instinct. It could not be doubted that we were in the vicinity of a magnet which produced these terrible but strictly natural effects by its attraction. I communicated my ideas to my companions, and they regarded this explanation as conclusive, in presence of the physical facts of which we were the actual witnesses. "We shall incur no risk by going to the foot of the mound, I suppose?" said Captain Len Guy. "None," I replied. "There, yes, here." I could not describe the impression those three words made upon us. Edgar Poe would have said that they were three cries from the depths of the underworld. It was Dirk Peters who had spoken, and his body was stretched out in the direction of the Sphinx, as though it had been turned to iron and was attracted by the magnet. Then he sped swiftly towards the Sphinx-like mound, and his companions followed him over rough ground strewn with volcanic remains of all sorts. The monster grew larger as we neared it, but lost none of its mythological shape. Alone on that vast plain it produced a sense of awe. but this could only have been a delusion, we seemed to be drawn towards it by the force of its magnetic attraction. On arriving at the base of the mound, we found there the various articles on which the magnet had exerted its powers: arms, utensils, the grapnel of the paracuta, all adhering to the sides of the monster. There were also the iron relics of the Halbrane's boat, all her utensils, arms, and fittings, even to the nails and the iron portions of the rudder. There was no possibility of regaining possession of any of these things, even had they not adhered to the lodestone rock at too great a height to be reached. They adhered to it too closely to be detached. Hurliguerly was infuriated by the impossibility of recovering his knife, which he recognized at 50 feet above his head, and cried as he shook his clenched fist at the imperturbable monster, "Thief of a Sphinx!" Of course, the things which had belonged to the Halbrane's boat and the paracutas were the only articles that adorned the mighty sides of the lonely mystic form. Never had any ship reached such a latitude of the Antarctic Sea. Hearne and his accomplices, Captain Len Guy and his companions, were the first who had trodden this point of the southern continent, and any vessel that might have approached this colossal magnet must have incurred certain destruction. Our schooner must have perished, even as its boat had been dashed into a shapeless wreck. West now reminded us that it was imprudent to prolong our stay on this land of the Sphinx, a name to be retained. Time pressed, and a few days' delay would have entailed our wintering at the foot of the ice barrier. The order to return to the beach had just been given, when the voice of the half-breed was again heard as he cried out, "There! There! There!" We followed the sounds to the back of the monster's right paw, and we found Dirk Peters on his knees, with his hands stretched out before an almost naked corpse, which had been preserved intact by the cold of these regions, and was as rigid as iron. The head was bent, a white beard hung down to the waist, the nails of the feet and hands were like claws. How had this corpse been fixed to the side of the mound at 6 feet above the ground? Across the body, held in place by its crossbelt, we saw the twisted barrel of a musket, half eaten by rust. "Pym, my poor Pym!" groaned Dirk Peters. He tried to rise that he might approach and kiss the ossified corpse. But his knees bent under him. A strangled sob seemed to rend his throat. With a terrible spasm his faithful heart broke, and the half-breed fell back, dead. The story was easy to read. After their separation, the boat had carried Arthur Pym through these Antarctic regions. Like us, once he had passed beyond the South Pole, he came into the zone of the monster, and there, while his boat was swept along on the northern current, he was seized by the magnetic fluid before he could get rid of the gun, which was slung over his shoulder, and hurled against the fatal lodestone Sphinx of the ice realm. Now the faithful half-breed rests under the clay of the land of the Antarctic Mystery, by the side of his poor Pym, that hero whose strange adventures found a chronicler no less strange in the great American poet. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. A Little Remnant. That same day, in the afternoon, the paracuta departed from the coast of the land of the Sphinx, which had lain to the west of us since the 21st of February. By the death of Dirk Peters, the number of the passengers was reduced to 12. These were all who remained of the double crew of the two schooners, the first comprising 38 men, the second 32, in all 70 souls. But let it not be forgotten that the voyage of the Halbrane had been undertaken in fulfilment of a duty to humanity, and 4 of the survivors of the Jane owed their rescue to it. And now there remains but little to tell, and what must be related as succinctly as possible. It is unnecessary to dwell upon our return voyage, which was favoured by the constancy of the currents and the wind to the northern course. The last part of the voyage was accomplished amid great fatigue and suffering, but it ended in our safe deliverance from all these. Firstly, a few days after our departure from the land of the Sphinx, the sun set behind the western horizon to reappear no more for the whole winter. It was then the midst of the semi-darkness of the austral night that the Paracuta pursued her monotonous course. True, the southern polar lights were frequently visible, but they were not the sun, that single orb of day which had illumined our horizons during the months of the Antarctic summer, and their capricious splendour could not replace his unchanging light. That long darkness of the poles sheds a moral and physical influence on mortals which no one can elude, a gloomy and overwhelming impression almost impossible to resist. Of all of the Paracuta's passengers, the boatswain and Endicott only preserved their habitual good humour. Those two were equally insensible to the weariness and the peril of a voyage. I also except West, who was ever ready to face every eventuality, like a man who is always on the defensive. As for the two brothers Guy, their happiness in being restored to each other made them frequently oblivious to the anxieties and risks of the future. Of Hurliguerly I cannot speak too highly. He proved himself a thoroughly good fellow, and it raised our drooping spirits to hear him repeat in his jolly voice, "We shall get to port all right, my friends, be sure of that, and if you can only reckon things up, you will see that we have had more good luck than bad. Oh yes, I know there was the loss of our schooner, poor Halbrane, carried up into the air like a balloon, then flung into the deep like an avalanche. But, on the other hand, there was the iceberg, which brought us to the coast, and the Tsalal boat, which brought us and Captain William Guy and his 3 companions together. And don't forget the current and the breeze that has pushed us on up to now, and will keep pushing us on, I am sure of that. With so many trumps in our hand, we cannot possibly lose the game. The only thing to be regretted is that we shall have to get ashore again in Australia or New Zealand, instead of casting anchor at the Kerguelens, near the quay of Christmas Harbour, in front of the Green Cormorant." For a week we pursued our course without deviation to east or west, and it was not until the 21st of March that the Paracutas lost sight of Halbrane Land, being carried towards the north by the current, while the coastline of the continent, for such we are convinced it is, trended in a round curve to the northeast. Although the waters of this portion of the sea were still open, they carried a flotilla of icebergs or ice fields. Hence arose serious difficulties, and also dangers to navigation in the midst of the gloomy mists, when we had to manoeuvre between these moving masses, either to find passage or to prevent our little craft from being crushed like grain between the millstones. Besides, Captain Len Guy could no longer ascertain his position either in latitude or longitude, the sun being absent. Calculations by the positions of the stars were too complicated. It was impossible to take altitudes, and the Paracuta abandoned herself to the action of the current, which invariably bore us northward, as the compass indicated. By keeping the reckoning of its medium speed, however, we concluded that on the 27th of March our boat was between the 69th and the 68th parallels, that is to say, some 70 miles only from the Antarctic Circle. Ah, if no obstacle to the course of our perilous navigation had existed, if passage between this inner sea of the southern zone and the waters of the Pacific Ocean had been certain, the Paracuta might have reached the extreme limit of the austral seas in a few days. But a few hundred miles more to sail, and the iceberg barrier would confront us with its immovable rampart, and unless a passage could be found, we should be obliged to go round it, either by the east or by the west. Once cleared, indeed! Ah, once cleared, we should be in a frail craft upon the terrible Pacific Ocean, at the period of the year when its tempests rage with redoubled fury, and strong ships dread the might of its waves. We were determined not to think of this. Heaven would come to our aid. We should be picked up by some ship. This the boatswain asserted confidently, and we were bound to believe the boatswain. For 6 entire days, until the end of April, the Paracuta held her course among the ice barrier, whose crest was profiled at an altitude of between 700 and 800 feet above the level of the sea. The extremities were not visible either on the east or the west, and if our boat did not find an open passage we could not clear it. By a most fortunate chance a passage was found on the above mentioned date, and attempted, amid 1,000 risks. Yes, we required all the zeal, skill, and courage of our men and their chiefs to accomplish such a task. At last we were in the South Pacific waters, but our boat had suffered severely in getting through, and it had sprung more than one leak. We were kept busy in bailing out the water, which also came in from above. The breeze was gentle, the sea more calm than we could have hoped, and the real danger did not lie in the risks of navigation. No, it arose from the fact that not a ship was visible in these waters. Not a whaler was to be seen on the fishing grounds. At the beginning of April these places are forsaken, and we arrived some weeks too late. We learned afterwards that had we arrived a little sooner, we should have met the vessels of the American expedition. In fact, on the 1st of February, by 95° 50' longitude and 64° 17' latitude, Lieutenant Wilkes was still exploring these seas in one of his ships, the Vincennes, after having discovered a long extent of coast stretching from east to west. On the approach of the bad season he returned to Hobart Town in Tasmania. The same year the expedition of the French captain Dumont d'Urville, which started in 1838, discovered Adélie Land in 66° 30' latitude and 38° 21' east longitude, and Clare Coast in 64° 30' and 129° 54', their campaign having ended with these important discoveries. The Astrolabe and the Zélé left the Antarctic Ocean and returned to Hobart Town. None of these ships then were in those waters, so that when our nutshell Paracuta was alone on a lone sea, beyond the ice barrier, we were bound to believe that it was no longer possible we could be saved. We were 1,500 miles away from the nearest land, and winter was a month old. Hurliguerly himself was obliged to acknowledge the last fortunate chance upon which he had counted failed us. On the 16th of April we were at the end of our resources. The sea began to threaten. The boat seemed likely to be swallowed up in the angry waves. "A ship!" cried the boatswain, and on the instant we made out a vessel about 4 miles to the northeast, beneath the mist which had suddenly risen. Signals were made, signals were perceived. The ship lowered her largest boat and sent it to our rescue. The ship was the Tasman, an American three-master, from Charlestown, where we were received with eager welcome and cordiality. The captain treated my companions as though they had been his own countrymen. The Tasman had come from the Falkland Islands, where the captain had learned that 7 months previous the American schooner Halbrane had gone to the southern seas in search of the shipwrecked people of the Jane, but as the season advanced, the schooner not having reappeared, she was given up for lost in the Antarctic regions. 15 days after our rescue, the Tasman disembarked the survivors of the crew of the 2 schooners at Melbourne, and it was there that our men were paid the sums they had so hardly earned and so well deserved. We then learned from the maps that the Paracuta had debouched into the Pacific from the land called Clare by Dumont d'Urville, and the land called Fabricia, which was discovered in 1838 by Bellenny. Thus terminated this adventure and extraordinary expedition, which cost, alas, too many victims. Our final word is that although the chances and the necessities of our voyage carried us further towards the South Pole than those who preceded us, although we actually did pass beyond the axial point of the terrestrial globe, discoveries of great value still remain to be made in those waters. Arthur Pym, the hero whom Edgar Poe has made so famous, has shown the way. It is for others to follow him, and to wrest the last Antarctic mystery from the Sphinx of the Ice Realm. The End. End of chapter 26. And end of the Antarctic Mystery, or the Sphinx of the Ice Fields. Read for LibriVox by Esther.